The smell of bleach never really leaves your hands. It gets into the whorls of your fingerprints and stays there, a ghost you carry into rooms that smell like money instead. 6 men had failed. A 7th stood in the corner, sweating through a suit that cost more than she made in a year. And the woman they'd forgotten to notice, the one who still had detergent under her nails, was the only person left in the room who hadn't been told no. She didn't say anything clever. She just reached out. It wasn't ceremony. It was a hand, going somewhere it had no business going. The room held its breath for 40 seconds. Nobody in it would ever describe those 40 seconds the same way twice. 6 days earlier, Marisol Vance smelled like fabric softener and someone else's sweat, and that was just Tuesday. The scent came from the Wentmore Laundry Service industrial dryers, 11 of them, always running, always hot, lined up like patient animals in a concrete room with one window painted shut. Lavender and linen softener, the cheap institutional kind that came in 40-pound drums, clung to her skin so completely that even after a shower, it lived in the creases of her elbows, behind her ears, in the part of her hair. She'd stopped noticing it around year 3. Other people noticed it for her, a flinch on the bus, a small step back in the elevator. She'd stopped noticing that too. She was 34, her hands were 44. 14 years of hot water and industrial detergent had done to her knuckles what a decade of manual labor does to anyone. Swollen at the joints, permanently pink, the nails cut close because anything longer caught in the folding machines. She wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, all from the same rack at a discount store on Route 9, all a shade of grey, chosen specifically because grey doesn't show what grey hides. Rent was $1,140 a month for a studio above a shuttered dry cleaner. An irony she'd made peace with the way you make peace with anything you can't afford to be angry about. She was $340 short this month, not because she'd spent carelessly, because her hours had been cut from 40 to 31, because the dryer on the end had finally died and nobody replaced it, because the math of her life had never once in 14 years balanced without her holding her breath at the end of it. She ate the same dinner 4 nights a week, rice, a can of beans, whatever hot sauce was on sale. Her dog, a 14-pound terrier mix named Biscuit, with one ear that never stood upright, ate better than she did most nights, because the vet had been very clear about the kidney food and very unclear about how she was supposed to afford it. She'd started buying the wrong bag twice now, the beef instead of the chicken, because the beef was $2.11 cheaper and Biscuit didn't seem to know the difference, even if the vet would. At work, she was furniture. Mr. Halloway, who ran the laundry service, spoke to her the way men speak to appliances that are still technically under warranty, flatly, without eye contact, only when something wasn't working. The clients whose sheets she pressed, whose silk blouses she hand-washed in a sink because the machines would wreck them, never learned her name. She was the woman, as in, tell the woman we need this back by 6, as in, does the woman know how to get wine out of cashmere? She did, in fact, know how to get wine out of cashmere. She knew 40 things like that, small, precise pieces of knowledge nobody had ever asked her to explain, because nobody had ever asked her anything at all. Her routine had exactly one indulgence. On Fridays, she walked the 6 blocks to the Wentmore account that paid the best, a residential account, a name on a clipboard she never fully looked at, a townhouse with black windows and 2 men outside who didn't wear uniforms but stood like men who'd once worn uniforms. She dropped off garment bags, picked up new ones, said nothing, was told nothing. The house smelled like cedar and gun oil, and, faintly, always, an expensive cologne, bergamot and something darker underneath, like a struck match. She never saw the man who wore it. She only smelled the rooms he'd been in. The bus ride to work took 26 minutes if the 14 came on time, which it did maybe half the days that mattered. She rode it with the same 11 or 12 regulars, a nurse coming off nights, 2 teenagers who should have been in school, a man who talked to himself in a language she'd never placed and never asked about, and she always sat in the 3rd row on the right, because the heater vent under that seat was the only one that worked, and because from there she could watch the door without anyone thinking she was watching anything. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, built the way a callus builds, one small, unexamined decision at a time, until you don't remember making it anymore. 14 years of hauling other people's silk and cashmere through a city that didn't care whether she made rent had taught her to always know where the door was. She'd never once needed to use that knowledge. She'd never once stopped keeping it either. At Wentmore, the morning started the same way it always did. Holloway standing over the intake log with his coffee, not looking up, saying the woman's on drop-off today. Right. Like there might be some other woman he'd hired without telling him. There wasn't. There'd only ever been her, for 14 years, and 2 teenagers who quit within a month each, because you couldn't pay someone minimum wage to stand over a mangle iron for 8 hours and expect them to stay unless they had nowhere else standing open for them either. She'd learned the machines the way she'd learned everything, by paying closer attention than anyone asked her to. The number 3 dryer ran 4 degrees hot and scorched anything with elastane if you left it a minute too long. The steam press on the left stuck at the corner unless you tapped it twice, a specific rhythm, 2 soft knocks, like knuckles on a door nobody was going to answer. Nobody had taught her these things. Nobody had needed to. She simply noticed, the way she noticed everything, filing away small true facts about broken machines and worn collars and men who leaned to one side without knowing they did it. Because when you are furniture, watching is the only thing left that's still yours. She kept a coffee can on top of her refrigerator with $212 in it, counted every Sunday night, a habit from a childhood where the counting itself had once been the only thing that felt like control. This month, the can held less than it should have, because Biscuit's vet bill had come due, because the dryer at work breaking meant she'd covered 2 extra loads by hand, on her own unpaid time, just to keep the account from complaining, because rent had gone up $40 in January, the way it went up $40 every January, with a form letter and no explanation and no negotiation. She did the math the way she always did the math, sitting at her kitchen table with the calculator app and a pen, writing numbers on the back of a torn envelope because the pen felt more honest than the phone somehow. $1,140 rent, $312 in the can, a vet bill for $95 due Friday that she hadn't told the vet she couldn't fully cover yet. She sat with the numbers a long time, the way you sit with a math problem that isn't going to change no matter how long you stare at it. And then she fed Biscuit the wrong bag of food again because it was $2.11 cheaper, and told herself, the way she told herself every month, that next month would be different, knowing, the way she always knew, that it probably wouldn't be. 60 miles away and 2 hours earlier, Julian Ashworth Crane was learning that his father was, in fact, capable of dying. The old man, Desmond Crane, 71, feared across 4 states for 40 years, for reasons people preferred to whisper rather than state, was in a hospital bed connected to machines that made small, patient, contemptuous sounds. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic, laid thin over something the antiseptic couldn't quite cover, the specific smell of a body running on machines instead of itself. Julian had sat in the chair beside the bed for 11 straight hours the first night, still in the suit he'd been wearing when the call came, watching the ventilator push his father's chest up and down in a rhythm that belonged to the machine now, not the man. He had built an empire out of shipping manifests that never quite matched their cargo, and at the center of that empire, bolted into the sub-basement of a building with no sign on the door, sat a vault. Not a metaphor. A physical vault, 11 feet by 9. Walls 2 feet of reinforced concrete and steel, built by a man who had died in 1994, rather than reveal how he'd built it. Inside it, manifests, ledgers, a set of documents that named names, dates, routes, numbers, with enough zeros to end careers, end marriages, end lives. Desmond had always said the same thing about it, the same 6 words, every time anyone asked. The vault opens when I say. He had never written down how. He had never trusted a combination to a person. He had built the lock himself, decades ago, out of parts and logic no living locksmith could reverse engineer, and he had never once repeated the opening sequence in front of another human being. Julian had heard the story of the vault's construction only in fragments over the years, the way you hear about a war from a man who was there but won't talk about the parts that mattered. Desmond had spent 18 months, back when Julian was still small enough to be kept out of rooms entirely, disappearing into the sub-basement with a single locksmith he'd hired, and then, according to the stories nobody confirmed and nobody denied, never let leave the building again, in any way that involved talking to another living soul about what he'd built. The vault had opened for the first time on Julian's 9th birthday, a fact Julian had never once mentioned to anyone, including, until 3 days ago, himself. Now he was unconscious, tubes doing the breathing his lungs had opted out of, and in 9 days, a federal grand jury would either indict Julian's entire operation based on documents seized from a warehouse, or the family's lawyers would need what was inside that vault to prove the seized documents were forgeries planted by a rival. 9 days, 216 hours. The number sat on the boardroom table like a knife nobody wanted to be the one to pick up. Julian was 38, and until 9 days ago, he had never needed to open anything in his life that a phone call couldn't open for him. He stood at the head of the table in a room on the 40th floor with a view of a city that owed him things it didn't know it owed, and 6 men who called themselves security specialists. Men who had, between them, diffused improvised explosives in 3 countries and cracked systems that guarded nuclear material, told him, one after another, in descending order of confidence, that the vault could not be opened without the one man who knew how, and that man was on a ventilator. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Julian's calm was the kind that made grown men's hands shake, not because he threatened them, but because he never had to. 3 years ago, a man named Petrov had been careless with a shipment and a number. Nobody had heard Julian raise his voice about it. Petrov simply stopped existing in any conversation anyone had after that, and everyone in the business learned the lesson without a single word being spoken to them directly. The room itself smelled like cold coffee and burnt wiring, the particular smell of 6 computers running diagnostics that had already failed twice each. One of the specialists, a man named Reyes, who'd once disarmed a device in a Karachi market with 4 minutes on the clock, kept wiping his palms on his slacks between sentences, a tell he clearly didn't know he had. Another, older, grey at the temples, a man named Foss who'd spent a career on the other side of locks like this one before switching sides for better money, simply stood with his hands folded like a man at a funeral, because in every way that mattered to him professionally, he was. "The manufacturer's dead," Foss said. "Died in '94. No apprentice, no notes, no blueprints we could locate. We looked, believe me, we looked in places that don't officially exist. Whatever's in that mechanism, he took the logic of it with him." "Thermal lance gets you through the outer plate in maybe 6 hours, said another specialist, younger, nervous in the specific way of a man who'd never had to deliver bad news to someone like Julian before. "But there's a secondary containment behind it. We can't map without opening it first, and opening it wrong. Destroys the contents," Julian finished for him, flat, without inflection. "I'm aware. I read the schematic before any of you did." Nobody argued with that. Nobody in the room, in fact, argued with anything Julian said, ever. A fact so total and so unremarked upon that visitors sometimes mistook the silence for agreement rather than what it actually was, which was self-preservation refined over years into something resembling etiquette. 216 hours, Julian said, not to anyone specifically, the number sitting in the room like a held breath. "The grand jury doesn't care that the man who built this thing is dead. They care whether we can prove the warehouse documents are forged, and the only proof that exists is behind 2 feet of steel that 6 of the best specialists money can buy can't get through." Reyes wiped his palms again. "Sir, with respect, if the combination died with your father, there may not be a way in that doesn't destroy what's inside." Julian looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Reyes visibly regretted every word of that sentence. "My father," Julian said quietly, "has spent 40 years building things designed to survive him being unable to explain them. He didn't build a vault that dies with him. He built a vault that punishes anyone who doesn't understand him. There's a difference, and all 6 of you are looking for the wrong thing." 214 hours and counting. Julian looked at the 6 specialists and said, very quietly, "Then find someone who isn't one of you." He didn't mean Marisol. Nobody meant Marisol. Nobody ever did. It was his assistant, a sharp, tired woman named Priya, who ran 3 phones and 1 calendar with the precision of a surgeon, who remembered, buried 9 folders deep in a decade of household accounts, that the laundress who came on Fridays had once, offhand, fixed the antique cedar and brass humidor lock in the study, when a locksmith had quoted 3 weeks and $800. Marisol had looked at it for 4 minutes and turned a bent hairpin twice and handed it back open, and nobody in the house had thought about it again until now, because nobody in that house had thought about Marisol at all. Priya brought it to Julian the way you bring a joke you're embarrassed to be repeating. He listened without expression. Then he said the 6 words his father used to say, except this time they weren't about the vault. Bring her here tomorrow. Morning arrived the way it always did over the Wentmore building, with the smell of hot starch and the low mechanical hum of 11 dryers, waking up one after another. Marisol was folding a stack of pillowcases when Mr. Halloway told her, without looking up from his clipboard, that a car was outside for her and she'd better not have done anything to embarrass the business. The car smelled like leather and money, a smell with almost no scent at all, which she'd learned over the years was its own kind of expensive. She sat with her laundry bag still over her shoulder because nobody told her to put it down, and nobody offered to take it, and the 2 men in front didn't speak to her once in the 40 minutes it took to reach a part of the city she'd only ever seen from the outside of. The building had no sign. The elevator required a key. She watched the driver insert and remove. The 40th floor smelled like bergamot and struck matches. Stronger now, close enough to place a face to. Except the face when it turned around surprised her. Younger than the smell suggested. Colder in the eyes than the calm in his voice implied. Julian Crane looked at the woman standing in his boardroom with a laundry bag over one shoulder and detergent under her nails, and for 1/2 of 1 second, something crossed his face that his security team, watching from the corner, had never once seen there. Doubt. You fixed a humidor lock, he said. Not a question. Cedar box. Brass hardware. 2019, she said. It wasn't locked. It was stuck. There's a difference. Silence. One of the security specialists actually laughed, once, and stopped himself. Julian didn't laugh. He studied her the way he studied a manifest that didn't add up, for the seam, the place where the numbers stopped agreeing with each other. Priya, standing near the window with a tablet she wasn't looking at, watched him watch the laundress and filed the moment away the way she filed everything that might matter later. You didn't ask why you're here, Julian said. You didn't offer to tell me. I figured that was the arrangement. Most people ask. Most people have time to be curious. I clock in at 11. She shifted the laundry bag on her shoulder, a small, ordinary gesture that in that boardroom, among men who moved like they were always being watched, looked almost defiant simply by being unbothered. What's this about? I have something bigger than a humidor, he said. I have a shift at 11, she said. The account said Fridays, not whenever. Somewhere behind her, one of the 6 specialists made a small sound like he'd swallowed wrong. Foss, the grey-templed one, actually took a half-step back, the way you step back from a small dog that's just bitten a large one and lived. Julian's mouth didn't smile, exactly, but something in his eyes moved, a recalibration, the specific look of a man updating a number he'd assumed was fixed. What do they pay you? He asked. At the 11 o'clock. Enough that I don't have to answer questions like that from strangers. I'm not a stranger. I'm a client. You're an account number on a clipboard I've never read the name off of, she said. That's different from a client. A client says please. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick enough that Priya actually looked up from her tablet. Julian studied her another moment, and then, for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, he said the word. Please, he said. Come look at something. I'll have someone call your employer and cover the shift. She considered it exactly as long as it took to do the math. A covered shift against 14 years of never once being late. And then she nodded. Once. The way you nod at a stain you've decided is worth the extra 10 minutes it'll take to get out. The elevator to the sub-basement required 2 keys and a code that changed every day, and even then it opened onto a hallway with a third door that had no handle at all, only a keypad the size of a dinner plate. The vault itself sat behind it, matte black, cold to the touch, with a dial and a wheel and a small brass plate worn smooth by nobody's hands, because nobody had ever touched it enough times to wear it smooth. 6 men, Julian said, gesturing at the specialists arrayed behind him like men at a funeral. Every method, drills, thermal, acoustic, the schematics from the manufacturer, who's been dead 30 years, nothing. Marisol looked at the vault for a long time, longer than any of them expected. She wasn't looking at the dial, she was looking at the brass plate, and at a thin, almost invisible ring of tarnish worn into it at a specific height, the exact height a man Desmond Crane's size would rest his forearm while working the dial one-handed. She'd spent 14 years reading fabric for wear patterns nobody else noticed, the exact spot on a collar that told her a man leaned his head the same way every day, the specific fray on a cuff that told her which hand did all the work. A vault, it turned out, wore the same way a shirt did, just slower. He favored his left hand, she said, even though everyone said he was right-handed in every photo I've ever heard about, which means somebody taught him to hide it, which means the lock was built to be opened by a man hiding something about himself, not by a man who wanted it easy. Nobody spoke. 11:42, 18 minutes until the room upstairs expected an answer nobody upstairs believed was coming. She set the laundry bag down, the first time all morning anyone had seen her put it down, and reached toward the dial with the specific, unhurried patience of a woman who had spent her whole life being told to hurry up, and had learned, somewhere in there, that hurry was how people missed the thing that mattered. She read the where, not the numbers, the where, the invisible history the metal kept of every hand that had touched it, the way a shirt keeps the history of the body inside it, long after the body's gone. Her fingers found the places worn smoothest, the places worn least, and treated them the way she treated a stain nobody else could get out, not with force, with attention. Behind her, she could hear the specialists breathing, 6 men who'd spent their careers being the most capable person in any room they walked into, now reduced to an audience for a woman with a laundry bag at her feet. Reyes had stopped wiping his palms. Foss had gone completely still, the way old dogs go still when they hear a sound only they can place. 11:47, 13 minutes left on a clock, only Julian was still counting. She turned the dial a quarter turn, feeling for the place where the resistance changed character. Not stuck, not smooth, but worn in a way that told her a hand had rested there thousands of times without ever quite completing the motion. The way a man circles a decision he's afraid to finish making. She thought of collars again, of the exact fray that told her which side of a man's neck carried more weight than the other. A lock, underneath everything, was just a garment nobody had ever bothered to read. Her breath had gone shallow without her noticing. Her palms, when she registered them at all, were damp against the cold brass. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the specific, focused stillness she got right before a stain either came out or didn't. The moment where you'd already decided you weren't going to be the one who quit on it. 40 seconds. The wheel turned under her hand, with a sound like a held breath finally let go. The vault door didn't swing so much as exhale, an inch, then wider, releasing a decade of stale, cold, undisturbed air that smelled like paper and dust and, underneath it, faintly, cedar. Nobody moved. It wasn't triumph on their faces. It was something closer to fear. Julian Crane, who had not been surprised by anything in 11 years, who had watched men beg for their lives without so much as raising an eyebrow, stood in the doorway of his father's vault and found that he had, for the first time in his adult life, absolutely nothing to say. The silence went on long enough that one of the specialists checked his watch, as if time was still a thing that applied. "How?" Julian finally said. It wasn't really a question. It came out flat, almost wounded, the way men speak when the floor they've stood on their whole life turns out to have had a trapdoor in it the entire time, and a laundress just found the hinge. "Wear patterns," Marisol said, picking her bag back up, like the last 4 minutes hadn't happened. "Same as any collar. You people just never wash anything yourselves." Somewhere behind Julian, a specialist actually sat down. He offered her money first, because money was the only language he'd ever needed to speak twice. They stood back upstairs by then, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look like something you could fold and put away, and Julian poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, a habit of hands that needed something to do while his mouth did the talking. $50,000, he said, for her silence and her time, which in his experience was usually enough to make people forget they'd ever seen anything at all. That's a specific number, she said. You have a formula for this? I have a range. 50 is generous. Generous for what? You haven't told me what I'm agreeing to be quiet about. She crossed her arms, and the gesture pulled her sleeve back an inch, exposing the raw pink skin above her glove line, and she saw him notice it and pretend he hadn't. I don't even know what was in that vault. I know there was paper. I know it smelled like cedar. That's the whole extent of my crime. It's not about what you saw. It's about what you can do. He set the glass down without drinking from it. There are 3 more vaults in 3 states I can't get into. There will probably be a 4th before the year's out. Men like the ones I employ can blow a door off its hinges. None of them can read a room the way you read that lock. So you want to buy the reading? I want to buy the woman who does it. That's not how taxes work, she said. You hand me $50,000 in cash, I either report it and lose 1/3 of it to the IRS, wondering where a laundress got $50,000, or I don't report it and I spend the next 10 years hoping nobody asks. Either way, I've got a target on my back I didn't have yesterday. He blinked. Actual physical blinking. A small tell he hadn't allowed himself in years. What do you want then? To go back to work. Holloway docs pay for lateness, and I've already lost the morning. I'm offering you a job. I have a job. She said it the way you'd correct a man who'd gotten your name wrong twice. I have a license for that job. I have 4 regular accounts, and a landlord who doesn't care what 40 seconds I did with my hands today. He cares whether I've got his money on the first. She left. She actually left, walked out past 6 armed men, and got back in the same car that had brought her, and the driver, under instructions nobody had to explain to him twice, took her back to Wentmore in silence, and she clocked in 9 minutes late, and Holloway docked her pay anyway, and that was that. Except it wasn't. The landlord's notice came Thursday, taped to her door in the particular shade of red ink, landlord's reserve, for people they've decided aren't worth a phone call. 14 days, $340 past due, plus a fee, plus another fee for the first fee. She was standing in her kitchen doing math with a calculator app and a can of beans when someone knocked. Not the landlord's knock, the landlord banged. This was one knock, patient, like a man who had all the time in the world because time worked for him instead of against him. 2 days before that, she'd tried, deliberately and with something almost like stubbornness, to go back to exactly the life she'd had before the vault. She'd worked her full shift at Wentmore, folded pillowcases until her shoulders ached in the specific way they always ached, ridden the bus home in the 3rd seat on the right, fed Biscuit the correct bag of food for once because she'd budgeted for it carefully after 2 weeks of the wrong one, she'd told herself, scrubbing a wine stain out of somebody's cashmere with the same patient attention she'd used on the vault, that the whole thing had been a strange, well-paid afternoon and nothing more, a story she'd never tell anyone because nobody would believe a laundress had opened what 6 professionals couldn't. It hadn't worked, not entirely. Holloway had looked at her twice that week, with something new in his face, not quite respect, more like suspicion, as if he'd caught wind of a version of her he didn't have a category for. And in the quiet moments, folding towels at 9 p.m., with the dryers roaring around her, she'd caught herself thinking about the 40 seconds, replaying the exact feel of worn metal under her fingers, in a way she didn't examine too closely because she suspected she wouldn't like what she found there. Then the landlord's notice came. It was Priya, holding an envelope, not a person Marisol had met before, but recognizing the smell of the building on her clothes, immediately. Cedar and struck matches, even 1 layer removed. He's not offering charity, Priya said, before Marisol could speak. He's offering a contract, 6 weeks. A number that clears your rent for a year and doesn't touch your day job unless you want it to. He had our attorney draft it around your tax bracket specifically, so you wouldn't need to say the thing you said in that room again. Marisol looked at the envelope for a long moment, Not because she was tempted, because she recognized, with the exact clarity she used to spot a stain that wasn't coming out no matter what you did to it, that this was a trap dressed as a rescue, and that she was $340 away from not being able to afford to care. Beautiful trap was not a phrase she used, even in her own head, but it was the shape of the thing she felt closing around her as she took the envelope. Morning arrived, 3 days into the contract, with the smell of new leather, the inside of a car that had been detailed specifically for her, a small absurd luxury that embarrassed her more than it pleased her. She still worked her shifts at Wentmore. That had been her one non-negotiable line, scrawled into the margin of the contract in her own handwriting before she signed it. Nothing about this touches my regular hours, unless I say so. Holloway didn't know what to make of the new punctuality. She was never late anymore, because a car that didn't run on bus schedules got her there 10 minutes early every single day, and he'd started, for the first time in 14 years, saying good morning to her, instead of just handing her a clipboard. She used the money exactly as she'd planned to, in the order she'd planned to, because a woman who has spent her life doing arithmetic with too little does not suddenly forget how the arithmetic works just because there's more of it now. Rent, first, 12 months paid ahead so she'd never again see a strip of red-inked paper taped to her door. The vet bill, paid in full, with an extra $100 left on the account against whatever Biscuit's kidneys decided to do next. New shoes, plain, not for herself, but for the dryer floor, because the soles she'd been wearing had gone thin enough that she could feel the heat of the machines through them. The coffee can on the refrigerator got refilled to $600 and then left alone, untouched, because touching it felt like tempting something. She didn't buy anything that would have told Holloway or her neighbors that anything had changed. That was deliberate too. She'd learned, from 34 years of being looked at and not seen, that visibility was a kind of exposure she hadn't asked for and didn't especially want. Let the money live quietly. Let her keep living the life that had shape to it, even if the shape had never once been kind. 3 more small jobs came in that first week and a half, a safe in a lawyer's office that turned out to need nothing more than patience and a magnifying glass, a lockbox belonging to a man Julian never named who paid in a currency Marisol didn't ask about, a filing cabinet in a building with no address that took her 9 minutes instead of 40 seconds because the mechanism, unlike Desmond Crane's, had been built by someone with nothing interesting to hide. Each time, Julian was there, standing a careful distance back, watching her work with the same unreadable attention he'd given her the first day, saying almost nothing, tipping his head very slightly when she finished, a gesture she'd started, against her better judgment, to look forward to. He never touched the money side of it in front of her again after that first negotiation. Priya handled the numbers, precise and unromantic, wiring exactly what the contract specified exactly when it specified it, and Marisol appreciated that more than she let on, because a man who kept his hands clean of the money was a man who understood, on some level, that money wasn't actually the thing he was trying to buy from her. The second test came 11 days later, in a warehouse that smelled like machine oil, and, underneath it, the ocean, because it sat 200 feet from a pier where a shipment worth more than Marisol would earn in 6 lifetimes was locked inside a second vault, smaller, newer, digital, installed by a rival who'd made the mistake of thinking modern meant unbeatable. This time there were no laundry bags. There was a room of 11 men, all of whom outranked her in every visible way, and one of whom, a broad-shouldered man named Denny, who'd been with the Cranes 8 years, watched her work with an expression that had stopped being curious around minute 3 and started being something closer to calculating. "You're the laundry girl," Denny said. Not quite a question. The way men say things they've already decided the answer to. Heard about the vault. Lucky guess, probably. "Probably," she said, not looking up from the keypad. Lucky guesses happen a lot to people who pay attention. Some of us have been paying attention 8 years. Then you'll know exactly how long this takes me. She kept her voice even, the same flat, unbothered tone she'd used on Julian in the boardroom, because she'd learned by now that steadiness unsettled men like this far more than fear ever would. Denny laughed, short and humorless, and turned back to his phone, and she filed the sound of that laugh away, the same way she filed a fray on a collar. Not because it meant anything yet, but because it might. The warehouse smelled of machine oil laid over brine, the ocean 200 feet away pressing its smell through every gap in the corrugated walls. Somewhere a generator hummed, uneven, like a man breathing through a bruised rib. She worked the same way, reading the small human tells machines couldn't disguise, the grease on a keypad worn thin over one specific digit, the way a man who used the vault daily would lean his weight without knowing it. This vault was newer, colder, its surface a matte composite that held oils differently than the old brass had, and for the first 2 minutes she found nothing but a smooth, unhelpful blankness, the mechanical equivalent of a stranger's face. Then she noticed the smell. Faint, almost gone, but there. Machine grease overlaid with something floral, hand lotion, the kind sold in a drugstore 3-pack, a smell that had no business being on a keypad, only cleared personnel were supposed to touch. She thought of every hand that had touched this thing, and asked herself, the way she asked herself about every stain, whose hand actually left this? 6 minutes in, she found what she was looking for, and something else besides, a second set of fingerprints in the grease that didn't belong to anyone with legitimate access, worn into the keys in a pattern that meant someone had opened this vault more times than the log admitted to. The floral lotion smell sat heaviest on 3 digits in particular, worn soft in a rhythm too deliberate to be accidental, the same rhythm, she realized with a small cold drop in her stomach, that she'd caught drifting off Denny's jacket sleeve when he'd leaned too close to watch her work. She didn't say anything about it. She just glanced, once, at Julian, and inclined her head a half-inch toward Denny, the way you'd nod at a stain you'd found on the underside of a garment where nobody thought to check. Julian's expression didn't change. That was the terrifying part. It never changed. "Denny," he said, in the same quiet, level voice he used for everything. "Walk with me." Denny didn't come back. Nobody in the room asked where he'd gone. Marisol didn't ask either, though something in her chest went very still and very cold. The recognition, finally and completely, of exactly what kind of water she was standing in. The vault opened 40 seconds later. She'd started counting without meaning to, the number becoming a kind of ritual, and inside sat what the rival had stolen, 3 months of Crane shipping records that would have ended careers if they'd surfaced in the wrong courtroom. Julian looked at it, looked at her, and said nothing, which by now she understood was the loudest thing he was capable of saying. The 10 remaining men in the room had gone very quiet, the specific quiet of people recalculating exactly how much they knew about the man they worked for. Nobody asked about Denny again. Nobody would, she understood now, not because they'd forgotten him, but because forgetting him out loud was the price of staying employed. Julian gathered the records himself, an act she noted because in every interaction she'd watched, he'd never once carried anything himself. There was always a hand for that, a Priya or a driver or a nameless man in a good suit. He carried these records the way you carry something that could still hurt you if you weren't careful, close to the body, without looking at any of the men still watching him. "You didn't have to tell me about Denny," he said to her, quietly, once the room had thinned out. "You could have let it go." "I don't leave stains half-cleaned," she said. "Doesn't matter whose shirt it is." He looked at her a long moment, the same recalibrating look from the boardroom, except this time it didn't fade back into calm. It stayed, unresolved, on his face all the way to the car. By midnight, the air smelled of rain that hadn't started falling yet, that particular held-breath smell of a city about to get soaked, when he found her sitting alone in the corner of the warehouse office with a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched and hands that hadn't stopped shaking since they'd taken Denny out of the room. He didn't say anything at first. He poured 2 fingers of something amber from a flask into a second cup and set it in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "You're shaking," he said. "You just made a man disappear. I sent a man home." The lie sat between them, thin as tissue paper, and neither of them pretended it held up. "You don't have to worry about him again. That's not the part that worries me." He sat down across from her, close enough that the bergamot and struck match smell of him settled over the coffee and the machine oil, like something trying to claim the room. "What's the part that worries you?" That I'm good at this, she said. That there's a version of me who doesn't clock in late for Halloway anymore, because Halloway stopped mattering 3 volts ago. He reached out, not for her hand, but for her wrist, where the skin above her glove line had gone raw and pink from 14 years of hot water, and touched it with 2 fingers, light, testing, the way you'd test a stove to see if it was really as hot as it looked. I know what that looks like, he said. The wrist. My father had the same mark. From rope, not water. Different dirt. Same floor. Her pulse jumped under his fingers, and neither of them looked away from that. It wasn't romance. It was recognition. The specific, dangerous kind. 2 people who'd both spent their lives learning a room's exits before anyone told them where the door was. My father built that vault the year I turned 9, Julian said, still holding her wrist, his voice lower now. The quiet he used for orders, somehow different from the quiet he used for this. He never let me watch him work the combination. Not once. I used to stand outside the door and listen to the wheel turn and try to count the clicks, like that would tell me anything. He almost smiled, an expression so unfamiliar on his face that it looked, for a second, like it hurt him to make it. It never did. I was always the wrong kind of listening. You were listening for numbers, she said. The vault wasn't keeping numbers. It was keeping him. That's what you saw in 40 seconds. It took me 38 years not to see it at all. She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't have made the moment bigger than either of them could afford it to be. Not tonight. Not in a warehouse office that still smelled faintly of the fear Denny had left behind him. You said your father had a mark like this, she said instead, nodding at her own wrist, steering them both back towards something that could be discussed without anyone's voice breaking. From rope. Debt collector. Before he was anybody. Before the shipping. Before the name meant what it means now. He used to say the rope taught him more about people than the money ever did. Who tightens the knot slow because they enjoy it. Who does it fast because they're ashamed of it. He turned her wrist over, gently, like he was checking a seam. I think he was proud of it, in his way. The mark. Proof he'd started from the same dirt as anyone. And you, where's yours? Something closed in his face, quick, like a door pulled shut before you could see what was behind it. I don't have one, he said. My father made sure of that, which is its own kind of mark, if you think about it long enough. She thought about it. She didn't say anything else about it, because some seams you don't pull on the first time you find them. You just note where they are and leave them be until you've decided whether you're the one who's going to be responsible for what unravels. Nothing else happened. He took his hand back first. She didn't finish the drink. You should go home, he said. Halloway starts at 7. You remembered my shift. I remember everything, he said. And for once it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded, almost, like an apology. The car dropped her back at her building at 1:14 in the morning. The driver, a quiet man named Osei who'd stopped needing instructions from her days ago, pulling up exactly where the streetlight didn't reach, a small courtesy she hadn't asked for and had come to expect without noticing when the expecting started. Biscuit barked twice through the door the way he always did, the smell of bleach and lavender softener waiting for her the second she turned her key, ordinary and hers in a way nothing in the last 11 days had been. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her work clothes, Biscuit's warm weight settling against her hip, the way it did every night, and looked around the studio, the way you look at a room you're starting to suspect you might not live in much longer. The water stain on the ceiling, shaped like a state she'd never visited, the 3 grey shirts on their single hanger, the coffee can, $600 deep now, sitting on the refrigerator like a small, quiet lie about how ordinary things still were. She thought about Denny's face before Julian led him out of the room, and about the specific stillness that had come over the 10 men left behind, and about her own hands, steady on a vault dial and shaking an hour later over a paper cup of coffee she never drank. She thought about the mark on her wrist, and the mark Julian said he didn't have, and about how a man could spend 38 years building a life that erased every trace of where he'd come from, and still end up standing in a warehouse office at midnight, needing a stranger with detergent under her nails to tell him he hadn't erased it after all. Her phone buzzed once before she'd even gotten her shoes off. A single text, no name attached because Priya had set the contact up as unknown, per someone's instructions. There's a seventh vault. It's not his father's, it's mine. I'll explain Friday. She looked at Biscuit, who looked back at her with the specific disappointment of a dog who'd been fed the wrong bag of food twice this month and had strong feelings about it, that he communicated exclusively through sighing. Yeah, she told him, setting her phone face down on the counter, like that would slow anything down. I don't love that sentence either. Marisol Vance started this story folding pillowcases nobody remembered her name over, and she's ending it holding a text message from a man who just admitted, in the fewest words he's capable of using, that he has secrets even his own family's vault didn't hold. Julian Crane spent 38 years believing nothing could surprise him, right up until a woman with detergent under her nails proved he'd been wrong his entire life. Does she walk into that seventh vault, or does she finally walk away? And what exactly is a man like Julian Crane hiding that he wouldn't even trust to his father's steel and concrete? Tell me what you think happens next in the comments. I want to hear your predictions. If you made it this far, do me a favor and like this video. Share it with someone who needs a story like this. And subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the next chapter.